So, along with the Skinwalker stories and experiences that I've shared with you in the past, I've actually had a couple of stories with Dogman that I would like to personally share with you. Before I get into them, I want you to know that I've wanted to make sure I've done a little bit of research beforehand, so I can give you the most accurate details. I believe firsthand that there are actually different variants of these creatures. I was being hunted by a pack of them in the outback of Montana that closely resembled the werewolves from the movie Underworld, but not quite 100%. That was the only Hollywood image that they resembled closest. The second time I had a Dogman encounter, it was on the East Coast in Virginia, and that Dogman resembled very closely to that of the werewolf you see at the very end of the Van Helsing movie. Very scary looking, lots of teeth, and a large bodybuilder type of body. You know, kind of like a furry, black Arnold Schwarzenegger. These creatures are more intelligent than we give them credit for. It's scary. It really is. I believe they are intelligently designed to be a highly advanced killing machine. I've seen the way these creatures move together, work together, an intelligent pack mentality. They plan, strategize, and work towards a common goal. They are not to be underestimated. I've seen them deal some serious damage. Now, the first time I've ever had a real experience with these creatures was when I received a phone call from a gentleman whose name I will keep hidden in Montana. This man ran a rather large cattle farm who needed some help. He had explained to me that some of the things he was experiencing with his cattle disappearing and different means of finding them dead. It got my attention, to say the least. At the time, I thought it to be a possible Bigfoot situation, and grew very excited about it. In that moment, I only knew very little about Dogman. So I flew out there and decided to spend some time with this guy. His situation was far worse than I had imagined. Owning around 200 cattle, and at the time, more than 40 of them had been picked off, eaten, and torn in pieces. Finding different cadavers every day, in various stages of decay, and ways they were killed. Some were clearly eaten on, while others had their throats torn from their bodies, and others were missing limbs and major body parts. He suspected that this was the work of a clan of Bigfoots, after previously dealing with an aggressive clan of Bigfoots when he was much younger. He already knew what they were capable of. This is where I came into the picture. Using some special techniques, like night vision, we were able to determine very quickly that it was no Bigfoot problem. This was a Dogman problem, and a pack of them. There looked to be about 7 or 8 of them, with one really large alpha male. During the evening, they would scout the outer perimeter of this man's land, picking off cattle that wandered too close, or in this case, too far. Sometimes killing them on the spot, other times grabbing the cattle whole and then taking them off into the forest. The man that I was helping wasn't stupid. He knew that he was clearly outmatched and knew firepower alone was going to stop these things. He told me if they didn't stop a Bigfoot, they weren't going to stop these things. These are far more aggressive. When you're dealing with a pack of these things, you have to be very careful about your approach. One wrong move, and these beings could take your life. Even though this was my first time dealing with these in the physical realm, I had spent much of my time researching about these beings prior. Even though I knew very little, like I said, I still had a pretty good general idea. As the nights grew on, they continued to get braver, venturing further onto this man's land and taking more cattle with them. We got better looks at them, closely observed their behavior and how they would kill. These creatures were so smart, so strategic in their killing. FYI, we watched much of this take place through his night vision binoculars at a safe distance. Sometimes one of these creatures would tear a cow apart in half. Other times they would circle a few of them and close in on one of them. It was total bloodshed. I'll never forget when the alpha male, the one clearly larger than the rest of the pack and had what appeared to be gray running down its chest, would just grab small calves by their back legs, throw the calves up over his shoulder, and walk off with them, like they were some fresh kill, a rabbit kill. They were still alive and screaming. It was a horrifying sight, and this man had to just sit there and watch as his cattle were being taken down one by one. The following afternoon, just before dark, I decided to try and set up trail cams on the far side of the land, the area in which they came from every evening. I decided to go out a little further than the edge of his land so I could get a better and more accurate capture. I probably went about a half mile into this densely packed forest and started setting up some cams. It wasn't long before I could feel the distinct feeling of being watched. It was like I was an insect being observed by a human, right before getting stepped on and squished. I maintained my composure and kept setting up the cams. I could feel the air changing around me. I knew deep down in my gut that I now was the one being hunted. I began to hear the brush and trees move around from all directions. They were circling in on me and moving in. I pressed back the way I came, very cautiously, trying my hardest not to run, because that would have invoked a chase. They stayed close by the entire time of my retreat, just beyond my visibility behind the trees. They didn't follow once I made it out to the open. That night, we watched closely, and we heard these terrible screams and noises from the area that they came from. They were so loud and terrifying, it turned the man I was working with white as a sheet. It made him physically ill, nauseous, as if seeing these things through binoculars wasn't terrifying enough. Now, we were hearing their ferocity, for real. They never appeared that night to claim more cattle. So, we waited a couple more days before going back into that portion of the forest to retrieve my cams, only to find that they were gone. No trace of any of them. I set up 6 cams, all of them nowhere to be found, no traces left. They must have known what I was doing and been intelligent enough to sabotage any potential evidence that I could have gotten of them. I can't understate their high human-like intellect. Just like dust clearing and settling, they seemed to vanish after that. Even when I had stepped in the late afternoon, only a couple of days later to retrieve my cams, there was no trace of them. The forest was alive and full of noise, unlike how it was upon my first entry to put up the cams the days before. There was no ill feelings, nothing. Lots of cattle bones and skulls though, and old cadavers. We kept watching the following nights, and nothing. Activity seemed to die. I stayed for another 3 or 4 nights, and activity continued to die off. The gentleman I was with, who, by the way, again, has wished to remain anonymous for any future storytelling of this account, contemplated selling his land and all of his cattle. He had lost a total of 72 cattle to these creatures. Whether he did or not, I'm unsure of. We kept in touch, and I left to go back to my home state. To this day, he actually ended up keeping the land and the cattle, and he has had 0 problems and has slowly recouped his lost cattle. I'm unsure of why they left or what pulled them away. The man had been there for years, and the problem had only been up until very recently during the time. My strongest hypothesis is that they were passing through the area, saw there was lots of free food, and acted on it. They at one point realized that they were being tracked and decided to move to a different area. That's my at least best understanding of the situation. Now, on to the second time that I had to deal with these things. This time was much scarier in my opinion, because this creature had cornered me, and I believe if it wasn't for my friend burning plastic and trash, it would have claimed my life. I'm sure of that. At the time, I wasn't doing any real cryptozoology research, since I would take frequent breaks from research, just to live my life, and not obsess over it like some friends would. As much as I enjoyed it, it sometimes is putting yourself out there in the wild, with the purpose of being vulnerable, just so you could potentially capture a cryptid on camera. It's not all that worth it. At least that's how I felt. Sometimes you don't even have to do that for creatures to expose themselves to you. I learned this that time. I was far outside Asheville, North Carolina, visiting a close friend of mine for a 3-day travel stop. We never discussed anything strange, cryptids, paranormal, nothing. This friend wasn't a believer in any of that stuff. Things were very ordinary, as boring as that is to say. On the second day, I was helping him restore parts of this old large barn-like shed that he had on the far side of his back property. Yeah, you already know where this is going. Maybe I should have been smart enough before I offered to help that this could happen. Optimism didn't work out for me that day. Since he had recently broken his leg, he needed help, and being a good friend, I wanted to help the man out. There were some backboards of the shed that needed to be replaced, and fortunately, he had the lumber to use. I got back there and started tearing out the old boards on the back side of the shed. To my right, about 20 feet, is thick woods. Behind me, about the same length, is the same woods. And then to my left, the yard goes on for a while, all clear open grass. Then in front of me directly was the backside to the shed. I had my back turned to the woods, and I guess this is where I made my biggest mistake. I left myself open and vulnerable. My friend was on his front lawn, doing whatever he could with a broken leg to try and get stuff cleaned up, hobbling around. Even though I advised him strongly to take it easy, he was far too stubborn to do so. Like clockwork, I don't even think I was back there for maybe 10 minutes before those good old feelings of dread started to wash over me. In the moment, I don't think I thought much about it, though, and just brushed it off, tearing these old boards off. That's when I heard something heavy walking my direction from the woods directly behind me. I turned to see, and approaching me was this monstrosity of a being before me, slowly taking a step towards me, and then pausing, and then another step, and then pausing. This creature maintained the most intense look on its face, challenging me, staring me down, and sizing me up. All I could do was put my back against the shed in total fear as this thing approached me. I knew if I ran, I would be a dead man. I would be done for. And just like the movie I described, this thing was jet black, had a long muzzle full of sharp teeth that overlaid out of its jaw. Its stature was very wide, built with rippling muscles and long 4-inch black claws on each of its 5 fingers. Just like a wolf does, it had that distinct fluffy mane hair on the side of its face and neck. Unlike the other pack of creatures I saw in Montana that looked much more humanoid, this thing just looked like a werewolf on steroids. It towered over me, even from 20 feet away. It was like Goliath from the Bible had been a werewolf. Even though many others describe these beings with red eyes, yellow eyes, etc., this creature had eyes very similar to that of a wolf. Yellow, but with black pupils, and even had whites in its eyes. Very human-like eyes. Its face just had this very fierce expression. It crept towards me until it had fully stepped out into the grass in view. For the first time in my life, I saw this thing in complete form, full daylight and all. Even though I was on the verge of having a heart attack just from fear alone, you can't deny the magnificence of this being. Morbid, I know, but when you're around a beast this size and stature, it changes you. Before it took another step towards me, it stopped, looked over to my left, and began sniffing the air around it, just like a dog does when they smell something. It lifted its head up in the air, smelling. Then its ears immediately went back, and a scowl came across its face. Then, it turned to look at me in the eyes, gave a low grunt in dissatisfaction, turned around, and walked off back into the woods where it just came from. After it disappeared from sight, the sounds around me came back, and I was left there, lying against the back of the shed, nearly about to crap myself, having come that close with death. I said screw this shed and ran back to the front of the house to freak out on my friend and let him know what's in his backyard. Before I even got to the front of his yard, I saw some black smoke bellowing. I came around the side of his house, and the man has a large burn pit where he is burning all sorts of trash, plastic, food, you name it. The smell was atrocious, and now I know exactly what that creature smelt. I waved my arms and yelled to him, and he comes over to me. In a moment of hesitation, I had a change of heart. Maybe I shouldn't tell him. Besides, if the poor guy really knew, he has a broken leg. What's he gonna do? Be defenseless and hobble around? I just said that the shed has more problems, and it's going to need more than just wood. He looked at me confused, and even though I probably should have told him, I just didn't think he would have believed me. I told him I wasn't feeling very well, and I needed to leave early. He understood. I know this sounds crappy, but I was still in total shock, and wanted to create as much distance as I could from what happened. I think I just stayed in a hotel that night, until I left the state the following day. I couldn't stop thinking about the creature, and the fact that it was halted by the smell of burning trash and plastic. I never would have guessed. I have come to terms with it since researching, now that it was just another variant of these creatures. Hopefully I'll have more stories to share with you in the future.